Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Greta Werner and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Henry Halloran Research Trust, focusing on policy, impact and translation in the space of urban infrastructure, including housing and transport. First, I would like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We recognise and pay respect to the elders and communities past, present and emerging, and pay our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. So we're on the lands that the University of Sydney campuses stand on, the Gadigal people's land, and it's been here. They've been here for thousands of years and have shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. Welcome to our discussion of platformisation, digital placemaking, and the public realm. This event is part of a program of events run by the Henry Halloran Research Trust, a cross-university research centre dedicated to fostering multidisciplinary research on cities, regions, and communities, in dialogue with researchers, governments, industry, and the professions, and also the wider community. The Festival of Urbanism is our flagship program of public events to promote evidence-based dialogue. And this afternoon's event, we will hear from a variety of perspectives, including from different kinds of research, advocacy, and government. But before I introduce the chair, I would like to let you know that there will be an event this afternoon, and there will be an afternoon tea after this event at 4 p.m, followed by our Dennis Winston Memorial Lecture titled "The Golden Thread in Public and Democratic Life, Parks and Libraries as the Cornerstone of Our Cities." And we'll have Dr. Caroline Butler-Bowden, Professor Rob Stokes, and Professor Jennifer Barrett speaking at the Charles Perkins Centre starting at 5:30 p.m. So let me introduce our chair, Dr. Sophia Marlson. Dr. Marlson is a senior lecturer in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. She's currently researching how the translation of computational logics and technologies is being applied to hack housing and address the issues of housing affordability and innovation, as well as looking at the potential role of technologies in tenant advocacy. Her research is predominantly situated at the intersection of the digital and material across urban spaces and governance, housing, and feminism, with particular interest in the digital mediation and reconfiguration of relationships across these spaces. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you, Greta. So it's a pleasure to be here chairing another session at the Festival of Urbanism for this year's festival. The way we're going to run through this is I'll briefly introduce our speakers all at once, sort of one after each other, and then we'll move to the presentations. We'll be keeping to hopefully around 7 minutes per person. And at the end, we'll have questions from the audience. We've already got some submitted ahead of time, so we might kick off with some of those, which will give you time to think of your own questions. So I can go. There we go. Here's our lovely panel today. So we've got a great panel of experts in the field. And first up, we will have Nancy Marshall, who's an associate professor at the University of Sydney. Nancy's research and practice has for a very long time focused on people and place, with a particular concentration on reimagining smart cities and rural areas, redesigning parks and plazas, and rethinking community engagements. For many years, Nancy has been leading interdisciplinary teams of academics and government experts and private industry to design and manage smart public spaces. including smart street furniture with the Internet of Things systems to support social wellbeing and place governance. And in fact, Nancy's work on smart street furniture has recently been awarded the sort of New South Wales, what would we call that what do we call that, Nancy? What's the category? There you go. And it's up for the national competition later this month. So, you know, a lot of expertise and award-winning expertise here. We next have, well, we won't in the order and the speakers, but next I'm introducing Sandy Burgoyne, who's a research associate and PhD candidate at the University of Sydney. Sandy has a lot of experience as an executive in the ICT and government sector and contributes to new policy approaches for smart and sustainable cities. Her academic research is adaptive urban governance for smart places with the University of Sydney, and at the same time she also leads a team of smart place professionals within the New South Wales Government Cities and Active Transports Division. So Sandy's really bringing along a really interesting cross between practitioner governance and academic lens here today. We also have Luke Hespinall, who's a senior lecturer in design and is also the research partnerships lead at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Luke holds a PhD in design from the University of Sydney, as well as a master's in cross-disciplinary art and design at UNSW and a bachelor in computer science from the University of Sao Paulo. Luke's practice investigates the intersection of people, culture and technology, and that includes a range of theoretical and practical angles, like design interventions for and with vulnerable groups. It also includes the mediations of cities and culture through digital technologies across the fields of media architecture, digital storytelling, social and cross-cultural interactions, placemaking, urban informatics, and smart cities. So Luke has advanced discussion on these fields through numerous engagements with government, industry, museums, and academic institutions worldwide, and is also a fellow of the Social Impact Hub in Australia. And you may have seen some of Luke's work out in the urban spaces, particularly if you've ever been through Chatswood. So he'll be talking about some of that today. And finally, we will have Murray Cox, who is a data activist founder of Inside Airbnb, and is also executive director of the Housing Justice Data Lab. So he's a multidisciplinary Australian-American artist and activist based in New York, who'll be zooming in today, who uses visual, audio, spatial, and data storytelling to explore themes of equity. Murray, as we said, founded the Inside Airbnb project, which is a data activist project using data to help communities organise around impacts of short-term rentals, and is also the executive director of the Housing Justice Data Lab, which again uses data and maps to fight for the right to housing and the right to our cities. Other purpose-led projects Murray has worked on includes redlining, gentrification, food sovereignty, and building solidarity economies through data, maps, photography, oral histories, video, governance, collaborations, and cooperatives and community organising. So as you can see, we've got a wide range of expertise on the panel today, which will give us a nice diversity of insights. So to begin with, I would like to invite Dr. Nancy Marshall up to the stage. And I think, there we go. Here we go.
Thank you, everyone. And I've got, not that I'm expecting a call, but I'm just going to time myself here just to keep us on track. Thank you very much, so for that very nice introduction. I'm going to talk to you about reimagining the public realm and what that means. What do we mean by the public realm? And then bringing smart infrastructure into the public realm for a whole lot of different reasons. When I'm talking public realm, I'm thinking urban spaces like parks, plazas, footpaths, streetscapes, and even in rural areas, and we shouldn't forget that, They're often at smaller scale, but they're still there. We've got plazas and parks in regional areas, but we've also got unique spaces like rest stops and campsites, things that are only ever in rural areas. We've also got to think as planners, designers, about the form of our cities and towns, the structure and the function of them, and how we manage them, how they're governed by public and private people, and for the people who live there, their visitors, and a life in public space. We work there, we play there, we mourn together at times in the public realm. And that's what makes them meaningful for us. You can think of your favorite place and think you connect to people there, or you have a sense of belonging or a sense of that place. We can see by this image at Lithgow, which is Lithgow in the Blue Mountains, it's a productive space. It's a representation of their history and how people connect to that idea of what is Lithgow. And it starts to create a place identity. So our public realm and our public open spaces are really, unique and informative. When we think about what's in them now, so we know what they are, we know how we may connect or not, we can think of all kinds of traditional street furniture, bins, benches, artworks, signage, some that are clear, some that are not. The one in the bottom left, you can tell is from somewhere that has a ski culture. It's from Oslo. And the red chairs up in the top are fantastic red street furniture, traditional throughout Parks Canada. And they want people to go searching for that traditional street furniture. We can see artwork and it comes in all shapes and sizes, but when does it all become too much? And it starts, rather than to be public art, it turns into clutter. There's also new things like the smoking room down in the bottom left in Ulaanbaatar, or quite substantial public toilet services, and then signage that I have no idea what it means, but I just love it. It's the one in the bottom right. Someone's carrying a pink purse whistling upstairs. I actually have no idea what it was, but it's fantastic to say, can we do better than this when it comes to our street furniture? So let's get smart with it. And so I've been working with my colleagues at UNSW, Street Furniture Australia, and funded by the government. And we created this image first, which is what we call a smart pole at human scale. And it has features like potable water, water for you and your dog. It's got environmental sensors managing the microclimate in public space. This is right here in Georges River Council. And you can see all of those sensors wired up to a thing called the Internet of Things. I understand that, but it can get complicated. And that's a whole series of sensors connected all together and run up to the cloud, which I totally don't understand, but then to a dashboard that public managers use to improve our public space and our public management of that. This is another one I've been working on called the Chill Out Hub. It's also in Georges River Council. You can see another generation of smart street furniture. It's got free public Wi-Fi, as they all do. It's public free access to mains power, charging your USB. And we've seen all kinds of people be way more included in this public space when it's designed well and using some smart features. We're starting to get very smart, but it's starting to become a bit of a problem with that clutter concept. We're seeing everything from interactive signage and now e-vehicle charging units, but we don't know what to do with the cords, and it's becoming a bit of a trip hazard. This is a 3D printed bridge in Amsterdam. It's very easy to do, cheap and reasonable, and it's turning our cities into something completely different. We're reimagining them. We are getting living infrastructure that we can now manage with the technology of water flow and pH, soil and drainage. And so that's a fantastic kind of unintended consequence that we have with smart street furniture. Last few examples here, and I'm racing, but I am aware of the time. We're starting to see new things in public space, like the Chill Out Hub. And the one on the right is contactless street crossing machinery. So that is a result of COVID. So you don't have to touch anything anymore in public space. And the one on the left is now a deposit scheme running through London. And then at the far end, and I don't, condone some of these, but you can get your sandwich and your coffee delivered to you if you're an academic at UCLA. But we're also seeing robots in airports, and that's turning into fun for children and actually for people who may be hard of seeing or hard of sight. It's fantastic that there are these new contemporary smart pieces of mobile and more permanent features of smart street furniture in our places. We can look at safety and everything from help buttons out in rural spots like this one in the USA, or the use of drones, not for evil, but for good. And we're seeing that in rural areas where we're doing crop dusting, but also land use mapping using AI and becoming very, very savvy with what we're doing without risking human life to go take these fantastic photos that we need for planning. And the final one here is we're seeing the mechanization in rural areas. Yes, it's got its downside, but I think we are getting a new category of smart furniture, both in the urban areas, which I've shown, but also in the rural areas. And it's benefiting us, especially when it comes to things like cost of living. And we don't have to have things out on, outside, out to weather and what its impacts are. I will not go into driverless cars, but that is one that I've been in San Francisco for a half-hour drive on a Friday night. That's a whole other topic, but it's going to completely change our urban structure and form, and that is smart. And that scares me a little bit, but I'm excited also to say it's here. So let's imagine a new public space, and it's happening. If you go to Coogee Beach, it is absolutely run with smart technology. And here's some of the ideas that it's using, but I've added in some more. We know that they're now got their surf lifesavers wired up to GPS, and that's making them more safe and people who are in distress. Water quality sensors, shark sensors, safety drones. They're now using AI, I see today, for identifying rips and where people should and shouldn't go. And the other things you can see are improving the place experience. So surfers can look at the webcam. We've got digitized places for your smart lockers and cameras and things. So it's actually improving the place experience. The thing with smart infrastructure in public space is you can choose not to use it. I think it's making a place experience better and also more efficient for people who manage. Finally, I wanted to show a rural example of what's happening. This is an example of what's happening out in the Parks Shire Council. They're turning a dam area into something smart. Again, there's a GPS system on their safety buoy, and if that goes off the pole, someone comes running to help because they know that that's someone's in trouble. We're seeing sound walking apps with Indigenous elders talking about the history of the area, engaging young people who might have thought before going for a walk in the area is dead boring, but this is now exciting for them. They're learning about nature and the Indigenous history. They also have access to all kinds of smart things where they can be wired up or not. And so we know there are challenges and opportunities in every way to think about it. We know underground there's a whole lot of hardware that we need to do this. We know that there are smart apps that use our data, and then we are at the top applying that information and using it for hopefully good. I know there are challenges in this space. Governments and built environment professionals, I don't think are quite ready. And we can talk about that later in the panel discussion, hopefully. People are unsure about their data and where it goes and who has it and what they're doing with it. People are not even sure how to use some new technology in public space, and that's going to take time to think about it. And then we always have to defend as a designer of public space, why do we need it? And do we need it everywhere? I'm going to leave on this note because I actually think we're going to benefit greatly from other smart street furniture and smart public places. I think it does connect people, literally and across the planet. How many of us have family or friends across the world, and you can sit in public space and connect to them? And young people love that. If it's done well, our public spaces are more inclusive and equitable. And if that's in the design ethos, we're in a good place. Finally, I think we can use community engagement, and Luke may talk to this on a digital platform and get more people involved. And for someone who's in asset management or in parks planning, we are getting way more efficient in managing our public realm. And that's not taking jobs away from anyone, but it frees them up to do other work for the benefit of people using those places. I think if we do evidence-based good design and planning, we can make sure our places are healthier and good for well-being, and that we've environmentally monitoring what's going on in our public space. If anyone's really interested, this is some work that I've been doing with the New South Wales government and UNSW, including a couple of people on the panel. It's all about regional New South Wales and smart resources, so feel free to enjoy those. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy, for kicking us off with some really grounded examples and how this technology is used and applied, and its use across both cities and regional areas as well. And so our next speaker is Dr. Luke Hespinall, who will be building on some of these themes that have been picked up by Nancy. And over to you, Luke.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Nancy, for your talk as well. Hello, everyone. My name is Luke. I'm going to be talking about placemaking and its digital iterations, right? So I'm going to start with this quote by Fred Kent, the founder of the Project for Public Spaces, where he said that true placemaking is not just about the celebration or the creation of places where we want to go and spend our time. It's about creating communities that have a greater capacity to self-organize. And with that quote, what he's pointing to, the nature of placemaking has been more than just an intervention to the physical built environment, but more as an effort to redesign human-to-human relationships in and around urban public spaces. So PPS has come up with a wealth of methods and tools to help us design and assess great places, combining not only physical aspects such as comfort, image, accessibility, but also more intangible aspects such as sociability and the activities that get performed in a space. It also advocates for lighter, quicker, and cheaper interventions on public spaces. This idea of urban prototyping and testing out potential alternatives for a public space with not so much cost. If it doesn't work, it can be rolled back out. But it helps to, again, drive the conversation around the possibilities of a public space, and often in ways that can be done bottom up with the participation of community members and being involved in the co-design of those spaces. That said, another interpretation of placemaking comes from larger scale city making, which is usually done top down, like, for example, the pedestrianisation of George Street here in Sydney. And oftentimes, placemaking actually means an ongoing conversation between local governments and the community in order to reflect the values of the place users and embed them into the physical built environment. So that may take time and a lot of conversation, but again, people are involved in adding the values to the built environment. So all those dynamics over time have incorporated digital technologies into their making, not always, but often. And you could talk about similar examples that would be done top-down. For example, Crown Fountain in Millennium Park in Chicago would be an example of a top-down digital placemaking embedded in the design. Whereas Midnight Moment, the use of the digital billboards in Times Square in New York, could be an example of a middle layout approach involving artists that can submit the content to be played out at specific times as digital art. and towards the revitalization of the nighttime in that space. So I've been working myself, as Sophia pointed out at the beginning, for over 10 years in my research, my practice, with pop-up proposals, often in the guise of urban festivals like Vivid Sydney here in Sydney, in New South Wales, run by Destination New South Wales. All those works have been done as part of Vivid Sydney to test out different dynamics in public spaces and opportunities for engagement of the public. But I've also been occasionally commissioned by local government to involve community in telling or helping them or working with them in telling their own stories. This work was commissioned by Liverpool City Council in southwestern Sydney, in which I worked with a community of refugees from Iraq, and for 2-3 months, talking to them and then helping to create these animations, telling their stories, which were then replayed back onto the community in this urban screen in the main commercial street of Liverpool. This is another commission in Chatswood to revitalize one of the laneways as part of Vivid in Chatswood 2019. I worked with a group of students here from the University of Sydney to create a range of different interventions there, some interactive, some non-interactive. This one, for example, was an audio responsive infinite mirror that would allow live performance to happen in the space, have boombox performance, have an opera singer there. And again, those are dynamics that would not be normally found in that laneway, which by and large was deserted most of the time, but got transformed for the space of a month, trying out different the different perceptions that people could have of that. This is another work we had there, was a small wandering robot created by one of our PhD students, now one of our staff members, drawing with chalk on the street and inviting people to collaborate and to do the same. And that would get washed up every night and recreated, and therefore creating this cycle of public expression. And it was completely open to whatever people would like to write on the floor there. But again, welcome people to use the city as a canvas for self-expression. This is another project that I ran in Chats with partnership with local council a few years back, using computer vision to run a software in this urban screen in the concourse, to create a playful experience for people to participate in civic discussions around the area. So it was a pilot project, funded research to, again, testing out different ways to engage community. So all these interventions kind of follow the same patterns of the original placemaking as envisaged by its initial proponents and BPS. But more recently, especially during the pandemic, we start to observe this emergence of parallel narratives related to a space, but not necessarily located in there. And that you could be aware of some of them, maybe none of them. They may be restricted to some particular demographics, but they happen at the same time. And that made me to think about the concept originally proposed by French philosopher Michel Foucault of heterotopias, which are places with multiple identities. And I call them urban digital heterotopias because, again, they can change quickly the identity of the same space, potentially for different people. And they can be done for civic friction, like political dialogue, like those guerrilla projections in São Paulo, Brazil, which emerged during the pandemic, and some of them are still there. They work pretty much like a social media feed played out on the streets. Every day they have a different projection, and they actually are mapped with a social media feed, actually in a social media platform. So the dialogue gets amplified. Similar cases have been done to galvanize communities together for well-being purposes, for public art. This is one that I've done in São Paulo using the same platform during the pandemic. So people were not allowed to go to the streets. They could observe that from their balconies. Just a love message from the city back to people. And this is one example of a work by a digital studio from Seoul in South Korea. I'm sure you've seen this or variations of that before. The whole concept here being to create, to deploy in otherwise commercial displays like this, very fancy and 3D, to deploy images of nature. And therefore reintroduce, if not nature itself, at least reintroduce the feeling of nature and soften up otherwise bare public spaces. They have that as a concept for a platform to create that sort of content. It could be deployed on demand across the country. And that, again, emerged during the pandemic. So to finalize, those are still kind of the same evolution from the original ideas of lighter, quicker, and cheaper placemaking, which could potentially make spaces more accessible and inclusive. But on the other hand, the skills and equipment that's required, the investment that's required, translate mostly into top-down or middle-out interventions, which risk following dynamics similar to other platforms like social media or Airbnb, in the sense that they create this disconnect narratives between what happens in this space and what happens online, and we should not necessarily come together at any time. Also, different perspectives of the space, different makings of the space for different cohorts occurring simultaneously. So I'll leave it up there, and I welcome the discussion, the questions on the panel later on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luke. Really interesting presentation there around the role of digital platforms in placemaking, and also picking up on some of both the opportunities and challenges following Nancy's paper as well. So now we'll head over to Murray Cox, who is on Zoom, joining us on Zoom. Hi, Murray, and he'll be sharing his slides. And Murray will be bringing a slightly different angle to looking at platforms and the role they've played in short-term rentals and reconfiguring the housing market. So Murray, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about Airbnb. I think they would take credit for redefining how people travel. Maybe they take credit for maybe different definitions of home. But I would argue that they've played a big role in reconfiguring cities and communities, but also bypassing traditional planning tools like zoning and land use. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. But I wanted to start off just with a little case study on Airbnb in New York City. These were some studies that have been done by housing researchers that show the impact of Airbnb on New York City renters specifically. So the cost to every New York renter from Airbnb was $616 million just in 1 year. And then there's been other studies in 2018, and then a cumulative study that showed that renters were paying $2.4 billion because of the presence of Airbnb. And so Airbnb is not a passive platform. And so they talk about how, well, we could be benefiting low-income communities because if you host on Airbnb, you can make some money. It's not really a great argument. And then also it might benefit Black communities because it might bring tourists into Black communities. This is my neighborhood when I lived in Brooklyn. This is a Black neighborhood, and you can see all these kind of white faces. These are the photographs of hosts, and this was an original prototype of the tool that I built, collecting Airbnb data. But I went on to quantify that those disparities between the underlying population, the Black population of the neighborhood, and the Airbnb population, and I found that there was a 1,000% disparity. My neighborhood was 7.4% white, whereas the Airbnb community of hosts was 75% white. And so I think this kind of tells you how it's not just impacting housing, but it can also, this is showing you that these were gentrifiers. These people didn't live there a number of years before. They're either investors or gentrifiers into this neighborhood that were displacing either directly or indirectly residents so that they could rent out to tourists. These are some figures from the agency that's responsible for enforcing Airbnb. So you can see that 43,000 illegal Airbnb listings, significant proportion of Airbnb's revenue coming from illegal listings. And I don't say this to say that it's bad because it's illegal, but to really show you that these are decades old housing laws that are being broken. And so Airbnb and their hosts were able to break these zoning laws, definitions of residency, just at the click of a button. And so, and this is happening in cities and towns all around the world. In 2020, I did some research with Kenneth Haar. It was for the European Parliament. And we tried to break down how platforms like Airbnb were really failing cities, though they weren't cooperating with cities. And so there are also market failures. If we think about Airbnb likes to make us think that they're just competing with the hotel industry, but really they're competing with the housing industry. And so the cost of housing that you saw, I believe, are market failures and are a case for regulation. But there are also other smaller market failures. For example, with over-tourism, it reconfigures the commercial nature of neighborhoods. So for example, instead of there being shops that can service residents, there are shops that service tourists. That can also happen with gentrification, more restaurants and bars, but there can be specific retails or businesses, changes in the neighborhood, even just rents going up. And some people are starting to call this touristification, where it doesn't exactly intersect with gentrification. And some other themes that we talked about: if you can't find us, you can't find us. These platforms anonymize the activity, so it's very difficult to find the activity. What's illegal offline is legal online. So for example, the fact that these hosts are breaking housing laws, but you can't find the platforms unless there are specific regulations created to target the platforms. These platforms also have a team of lawyers. They refuse to share data unless that's built into the regulation as well. And so there's this myth of cooperation. And cities think that they can negotiate with a platform like Airbnb. But when I surveyed a whole bunch of cities for some research, the cities said, well, there's just no point in negotiating with these platforms. You have to regulate them. But at the same time, platforms will say that they want to be regulated. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, Airbnb had a sponsored interview on 2GB where they said they want to be regulated. And of course, they suggested how they wanted to be kind of pseudo-regulated. Just a quick snapshot of Airbnb in Australia. I started collecting data in 2016. There are just a bit over 50,000. Now there's about 170,000. In 2016, 60% of the Airbnbs were entire home apartment listings. So with a lot of potential to, so the majority potentially taking housing off the market. And if we fast forward to 2024, now 84% of Airbnbs are entire home apartment. So in addition to growing about threefold, the concentrations are still in this entire home apartment. And then also the top 20% of hosts control about 58% of listings. So there are people with large property portfolios. Yeah, I just wanted to leave that with you, but hopefully we can talk more during the Q&A.
Thank you, Mari, for really, again, enlightening overview of the way that platforms can reconfigure housing markets in the city and neighbourhood demographics actually as well. And so across all of these presentations, we've seen a little bit around, I think, the need, particularly in the last presentation, around regulation and the need to sort of come together and work through these things. As both Luke and Nancy have shown, there's challenges and opportunities, and the importance of involving the public in these decision-making processes. So our last speaker today is Sandy Burgoyne, and she is going to be looking at how actually people can come together to plan and make these places smart. So Sandy, over to you.
Oh, what is that one? I think my family follow Collingwood. So welcome everyone. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As Sophia said, I'm going to speak about how places are made and how actors come together, how government, how the community and the technology providers come together to realise some of the smart benefits that both all of the speakers have referred to today. Interestingly, the work that I have done has brought the concept of the seat at the table to the fore. So whilst I haven't got any slides, I would ask you to keep that metaphor in your mind. I will just talk a little bit about what we know about smart places and where that's going, but also just give you 3 examples from my research about who was involved in that smart place. And if you think about who was at the table, but importantly, who was absent, I think it provides us a frame to think about creating just places, places that are equitable and open to everyone. So in the public realm, the question is, how do we overcome the lack of transparency, and how do we make tech and the collection of data and the use of data more visible to everyone that's in the place? How do we increase equity? How do we plan our public places so that they leave no one behind, so that everyone has the benefit of that place, the wonderful places that Luke and Nancy have spoken about? So if we think about what we know about smart cities and smart places, the acceleration and the use of smart technology and data is just accelerating. It's continuing unabated, particularly with AI and quantum computing, and various sources of it has estimated that growth. One estimates the value is over 2 trillion in 2023. The second thing we know is that the gap is widening between the capacity of governments and therefore community to, well, not community in this case, but to respond to this challenge and meet the demands of citizens. And that was based on a recent survey out of a policy think tank in the US in 2023, Thought Lab Group. The COVID pandemic, we know, has heightened the demand for smart infrastructure. We all had the benefit of that, didn't we? Knowing where we were, knowing where everyone was, and so did government and technology providers. So following that, there's been greater demand for smart city governance and surveillance, potentially, and collection of data. So that need has been expanding. So we know those things are happening. We also know that whilst technology companies have driven that, we also know that governments are increasingly playing a greater role in that. I work for the government, even though that I'm actually here as a university representative. We're interested in the role that it can play in improving our public places for everyone. We also know that there are unintended consequences, that we can have the impact of piecemeal pieces of technology, sometimes just left in a public place, or it can be not fit for purpose. Second, we can have hyper-connected cities which capture too much data. So how do actors engage to meet this? When I looked at 7 global cities and the digital Western Parkland city here in Sydney, there were 3 examples that I wanted to share with you. So one was the city of Melbourne. It was a test bed. So that was the mechanism which brought a whole range of actors, 26 technology providers, carriers, community, NGOs, to think about how to use 5G and sensing technology in Argyle Park. It was very inclusive. The other example was Sydney Olympic Park here. in terms of event management. It was an innovation challenge. That was the mechanism. And it brought together the state government who funded it, the state authority that runs the park, software providers, the First Nations people, and an NGO that had an open standard for data. So the mechanism was the innovation challenge, but it actually brought all of those people around the table to actually solve the sorts of things that Nancy and Luke were talking about. The last example, which was a different scale, which was, a multi-decade digital smart city in Western Parkland City, was different. 3 tiers of government had to come together. 8 local councils, state government, federal government. How do we build this forward city? Now, who was absent from that table was the community, the First Nations community. So what we know today, because that city's still being built, is that it did deliver a digital action plan, which had a foundation in which to have inclusive design and also digital infrastructure, because what it also uncovered that 30% of the people in the Western Parkland City are digitally excluded, meaning can't access, can't afford or use the technologies that we're just talking about. So in that example, when we think about the people at the table, it brought a whole range together, but not everyone. So I sum up by saying I'm a supporter of technology and data, but we need to think carefully about how we engage broadly to make it a place that benefits everyone. And what I found in my research is that novel adaptive mechanisms, such as the ones I just shared with you, are some ways we can bring those parties together. We need to do it much better, faster, earlier. And with that, we can start to overcome some of the problems that we're seeing and hopefully deliver the promise without so many unintended consequences. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. A really nice way to, I think, bring the discussion together at an end there. So I'd like to invite all of our panelists up onto the stage as we move into question time. And while I give you all a chance to think about questions to ask from the audience. No, it's good. So good. I think there's some microphone. Oh, no, you're all hooked up on the microphones, aren't you? So you should be fine, I think. Yes. Okay, great. So while I give the audience a chance to think about a question, also, I might kick off with one of the questions that has been submitted online already. So this one is around technology and platforms and our understanding of what public and publicness is. So can you elaborate on how platforms have shaped understanding of public and publicness and use of public spaces?
Like all good panel members, I'll let Luke go first.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Very kind of you. Well, I guess depends on the platform you're talking about, but I think coming back to my talk, the first thing that I can think of is those parallel and simultaneous concurrent narratives about the city that may not necessarily intersect. So have different demographics addressing different perspectives of the city, and there's no friction necessarily. And therefore, the friction actually happens maybe too late when after the effect. I mean, if you talk about Airbnb, for example, when we realize there's a problem, those narratives have already been played out invisibly, as Murray pointed out, for a while. Likewise, when we talk about digital storytelling about a place that happens and is driven by particular demographics online only, without the participation of people at the ground level, again, there may be consequences that are only realized much later, and therefore there's no time to address them properly before damaging dynamics being put in place. I think that's the main, probably the unifying character across different platforms that I can see in terms of narratives, at least.
Look, I think, I mean, if I put my planning hat on, I would think of publicness being on a continuum, probably in the physical realm and the digital realm. And in the physical form, we can see everything from completely public access, like Pitt Street Mall, anytime 24/7 it's open, to very private spaces, but have public access during it. And so there's ranges in that continuum, and we see things that now they're called POPOs, privately owned public open spaces, and we can talk in great detail about who owns it and when that land is challenged of access. But if you walk carefully around places in the city, you'll see embedded in the sidewalks, sometimes very nicely looking markers that says this is now private space. Once you cross over, you're on private land, which means someone who might not like my pink shirt can kick me out. And then that becomes that problem of public open space in the public realm when it's really privately managed. I think in the digital world, it's quite different. It's a bit more of a free-for-all. Of course, I take Sandy's point earlier about equity and access to it. And I think with a good design ethos, we can ensure that people of all abilities have access to pure public space at that one end in the physical realm.
Mari, would you like to add to that or any comments?
I mean, I think about tourism a lot, and perhaps Australian cities don't have the same problems as European cities, like with over tourism. But I think thinking about the right to the city, the right to housing, and I think how platforms can create new markets that didn't exist before that can really overwhelm cities. And I think we all have in our minds the idea of Disneyland and our cities becoming Disneylands. And so I think it's important to prioritize people that live in the city and protect public spaces and their right to those public spaces.
Great. Is there any question from the audience? Anyone with a question? Yes.
Thank you. I've got a bit of a question around, we know that with the advent of climate change, we're going to see mass migration. We're going to see kind of life as we know it just change. And I'm wondering how you think that's going to impact the way that people show up and placemake and interact with public spaces, and how we can kind of design for that, I guess, resilience as we see the kind of, turbulent years. Thank you.
I might start. I think from what I know, it's an absolute challenge coming. For me, environmental sensors, will be useful. And I once heard the New South Wales chief scientist say, if we don't measure it, we don't know what the problem is, the extent of it. So then we don't know how to start solving it. So it's quite easy to put sensors around cities. It's not quite as simple as getting one from Bunnings, chewing gum and sticking it on a pole, but it's not that complicated. And so we can start to track very easily heat studies, especially out in Western Sydney, where we can manage that better, but we can get a scientific story of what's happening in some of those climate topics. We can look at sea level, we can look at water quality quite easily with a scientific longitudinal set of information. And then we know what we're dealing with and the amount of change. And I think for me, that having that evidence base to start with is a really good place to begin with, but that's a huge policy issue. I think placemaking, and Luke might comment on it, we've seen lots of artwork and digital ideas that bring that storytelling to the fore and have some lived experience of people going through horrendous circumstances, which may bring it even more down to the personal level.
I agree with those points. And I think it's important to dissociate the notion of smartness for data gathering and getting a better understanding of what's going on from the decision-making and the civicness aspect of living in cities, which therefore would ensure civic participation and be inclusive. When gathering data, if you have like mass migration, it's important to ensure that everyone is counted, that everyone has a seat on the table, but then to move on to the civicness, to the public deliberation around the decisions that will affect whoever is counted. And when it comes to placemaking, I made a distinction in my presentation about between digital placemaking and digital storytelling. But at the end of the day, or placemaking and storytelling, at the end of the day, placemaking is a storytelling, is about the narratives, the stories that we tell, and we pass on about the locations around us. And again, ensuring that newcomers have a seat on the table, that they participate in this storytelling and in the definition, what is the place for them and for all of us together who share a particular place is really paramount. And that's hard. I mean, that demands social friction and openness to just deliberate with an open mind what the city can become coming from going from here onwards. Yeah.
Murray, do you want to add to that or?
I mean, I do think a lot about part of my housing work is about defending against evictions, especially amongst vulnerable communities that don't always have a choice about where they live. And so I think under climate change, where maybe people with good access to capital might be able to change to migrate away from climate change. But I think thinking about people that don't have those choices and protecting their rights. I mean, I think it's important to be thinking about some of those decisions, especially if we're dealing with a lot more migration, intra-migration.
Great, thank you. So we're almost at time. So if you do have further questions for the panel, perhaps you can flag them down in the little afternoon tea area, breakout area after this. But first of all, I'd just really like to thank our panelists, our wonderful panelists, all four of them up there, and our audience for coming along today. And it's always great to have the Festival of Urbanism, and we try and put on a interesting program. So I would also like to remind you that we will have some afternoon tea out in the foyer, which is ahead of the next Festival of Urbanism event, which is the Dennis Winston Memorial Lecture, which will be on the golden thread in public and democratic life, parks and libraries as the cornerstone of our cities. This isn't in this location, it will be in the Charles Perkins Centre auditorium at 5:30 p.m. So, but thank you all. A round of applause for our panelists and for our audience. Thank you, Murray, for zooming in across time zones. It was lovely to have you. And hopefully we will see you at other festival events. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie.